understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time. And John, how are you, man? I haven't seen you for a while.
I'm good. I hear, Mac. You are, forget about the Olympics. Forget the Olympics and medals coming out our ears. I believe you got a medal.
Oh,
recently.
John, I'm playing in the village tournament here in Croatia, right?
Out of
The
your
village,
skin, I'd say.
Village midfield general spraying balls around. And our team is called Devet Nogi, which means 9 legs. Don't ask me why that's the name of the team.
Yeah.
And we came third in the village tournament. And I actually walked up to the podium and got a bronze medal. That was hilarious.
That's the first medal since your school sports.
It's since the community games, John. Since the community games.
Yeah. In Santry.
In Santry, exactly. No, every year here, there is a village football tournament. And you realize when you play in that tournament, I'm absolutely woeful, right? But the young fellas, you realize why Croatia has been, per head, the most successful football team in the world since the 1990s, right? So Croatia is
hang on. The most successful team
per head of population. There are 4 million. There are 4 million Croats. There are 4 million Croats. They have never not qualified for either quarter, semis, or finals of every tournament they've gone to.
Wow, that's Modric.
Well, a huge amount down to Modric, but it's an extraordinary story. Croatian football.
That is incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible, and there's only 4 million of them. And when you play football here with them, you realize the technical ability, the skill level.
Well, they've got 9 legs, so that's a bit of an advantage.
Exactly. But anyway, the football tournament, and it was not only was there's a football tournament, John, but there's also a sardine festival that I've just come off the back of, right? Which I think you might like. It's called Srdlada, right? Which has been sardines in Croatia. And it's a thing that happens all over the Mediterranean in the middle of August. Remember we were talking about the shooting stars the other day?
Yes.
And another reason for these bizarre things in August is that during late July, there are full moons in this part of the world, right?
Yeah, well, it'll be in all parts of the world.
Yeah, but because, well, I know, but because there's no fucking clouds in the Mediterranean, right?
Right, you can see them, yeah.
And what happens in the full moons is that sardines come up to the surface because the plankton are lit at night by the full moon. And the sardines come up to the surface.
Yeah, they're attracted to the moonlight.
What happens is the fishermen go out with bright lights on the top of their boats, right? They used to do it with fires, now they do it with bright lights. And of course, the sardines think that the bright lights are indicating that they go up to try and get the plankton. And of course, they catch loads and loads of sardines. They bring them back to the village and there is a sardine.
And they stick them in tins.
They still have a sardine eating festival. It's just like grilled sardines. And I jest you not, they have an old bed with springs and that forms the grill. And they put thousands of sardines on the thing, grill them up, and everyone just gets hammered. So that's why I'm looking a little bit tender today.
Yes.
The night before. Having won the football medal, John, and the sardines, Srdlada. No, Google it.
Right.
And it's of course, it's a big, big night out. But anyway, it's good. How are you, Ed? How's Dublin?
Dublin is great. I mean, it's like, as my daughter once said, the weather is like living in a Tupperware box. It's just this overcast grey sky and stuffy, clammy weather. And it's like living in a Tupperware box. And I think it's a great description. And that's what it's like at the moment.
Awful.
Where is the summer?
So, John, you remember we had a chat last week and you were saying that mates of yours said, you know what? I couldn't be arsed going into town. I don't go to town anymore.
Yes, yeah.
And then what I did was, as a result of that, of your editorial nous, John, did a little bit of research with Eliza about actually what's happening in Dublin. And this is this thing that the Americans call the donut effect, which is that the centre city becomes hollowed out due to crime, high rents, not enough venues, because of high prices, all those sort of stuff, and not enough residential footfall, not enough people living in the city. It becomes hollowed out, and the inner suburbs and the suburbs are where people hang out. And this is a real threat. The most notable example of this, and we'll talk about it in a second, and you noticed this last year when you were there, was San Francisco, once the premier city.
Yeah, it was always one of my favorite cities. I went there in the early 90s, spent about 3 months there, absolutely loved it, and actually had made plans to go back and live there.
Ireland would be poorer. Ireland would be poorer from the absence of John Davis.
But when I was back there, it was an awful weekend, I think I was telling you, really rainy weekend, but the streets were full, but they were full of homeless.
Exactly.
Because they had nowhere to go, and there was no kind of people hustling and bustling, going about their business. And it was so disappointing, so incredibly disappointing. And now I believe that a lot of the big tech companies who are based in San Francisco are moving out of San Francisco. The likes of Elon and his
Your
buddies.
mate, Elon.
Well, I mean, don't get me going on that fella, Jesus.
We'll keep that for a future podcast. John Davis on Elon Musk. No, but I think what's happening, so we're going to talk about that because I think that Ernest Hemingway was asked how he went bankrupt. And he said, at first, very slowly, and then very quickly. And I thought that was a really good description, right, of what happens to cities. That cities, at first, it's kind of a slow feeling. I won't go into town, et cetera, and then very, very quickly that becomes a stampede of people and money leaving the city centre, going elsewhere. And that, I think, Dublin City is at risk of this.
The last time I was in town, I went in specifically for an event. I went in to see a gig. And I was thinking about that. I was walking around town, and as we've spoken about many times before, the vibe in town was just a bit edgy, is the best way to put it. And I kind of realized that I don't really go into town anymore. And a lot of my mates don't go into town anymore. And it used to always be the fun place to go for a big night out. When you're going out, you know, you go to town and you have a few gargles and you have something to eat and you go to a gig and maybe a club or whatever it is. And then there's always the problem of getting a taxi home. But, you know, you worry about that at the end of the night. But I just don't do that anymore. And I'm not inclined to do that anymore. And I don't know anybody who lives in town anymore. You know, and this is the big change that has happened.
Okay, John, this isn't Dublin-centric. The idea of the donut theory of urban developments is an American idea. San Francisco being the city most exemplifying the donut effect right now. But Detroit, which used to be described as the Paris of the Midwest, right, in the United States, went through, again, exactly the same sort of development over a 10 or 15-year period where the center was completely hollowed out. New York went through something similar in the 1970s and 1980s. So this is basically the ebb and flow of development. But the key thing is that capital cities or big cities are very fragile ecosystems. And it doesn't take much to push a city on a different development trajectory. And I'm going to just give you a little explain. I remember years ago, John, you might have remembered, in 1992, I moved into a flat in Parliament Street, right beside the City Hall in Dublin. You remember that years ago?
I actually do remember that. I remember, was it a 2-bedroom place or a 1-bedroom place?
Little 2-bedroom place. Little 2-bedroom place on Parliament Street.
I remember one of the rooms was the size of the bed, or the bed was the size of the room.
It was tiny. It was tiny. But the point was, right, amazing for listeners who are au fait with Parliament Street now. In that building, which is a refurbished 18th century building, very, very beautiful refurbishment, right? Done with great, great care. We had 4 flats. Those 4 residents were the only people living on Parliament Street. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
In 1992, there was absolutely...
It was smack in the heart of the city.
Right in the heart of the city, right? You walk to work, you're beside everything. There was one bar. There was the Parliament Inn, which was Dublin's only gay bar, which was just on the corner there. There was a newsagent's, and there was a shop called Reed's Cutlers, which was an actual sword shop. Can you believe that?
What?
It sold swords, right? And knives and all sorts of things, but it was really, really old school.
I'd say they did a roaring trade.
Exactly. No, they disappeared very quickly, right? But the point is, John, if you think about Parliament Street now, bustling, you know, trees, it's got almost like a boulevard, right? But back then, the only thing that kept you awake at night was the roar of the buses coming up from the quays and swinging around by City Hall. I remember those old Dublin buses, the big polluting yokes.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize then that in 1992 constituted the low point of Dublin's inner city development. That Dublin inner city, between the canals, had between 1960 and 1990 lost half of its population. Half of its population, right?
Wow.
And the reason was that Dublin, it's bizarre from people who are aware of the city now, but back then, lots and lots of the retail and commercial space in Dublin were little small factories, was little small industries. And they mainly went bust in the 60s and 70s. And therefore, there was no jobs in the inner city. So therefore, people left the inner city. There was no development. I think, in fairness to Dublin planners, they were very obsessed with roads at the time. Remember, we talked about the fact that Dublin planners just loved building roads through all sorts of areas. And it was a really unwelcoming place for people. I'll give you a statistic, right? Between 1966 and 1974, the inner city of Dublin lost 550,000 square meters of industrial floor space. Now think about that, right?
Wow.
30% of the entire industrial floor space in the inner city disappeared because all those companies went bust, or they relocated out to the suburbs because the suburbs were cheaper and because it was easy to get there, and because we were beginning to have a car culture in the 60s and 70s in Ireland. People wanted to live and drive to wherever they worked.
And this is the time as well when the likes of Tala was being developed.
Exactly.
And growing, and Clondalkin and all the West Dublin in particular, but also South Dublin and Dunleary. There was a lot of building around here.
It was the suburbanization of Ireland, that people chose to live in the suburbs, and people left either by design or by choice. They left the inner city. But since 1992, or around that period, Dublin City has transformed itself. There was a report commissioned by the Dublin Inner City Partnership, and it talks about Dublin in the early 90s. And I'll give you the quote, John. It says, "The deterioration of the physical environment was exacerbated by the blight caused by long-term road proposals and by inadequate conservation policies or rehabilitation incentives. Derelict sites stood like open wounds in the urban fabric. Once grand Georgian houses crumbled, the city was dying visibly on its feet." But that is Dublin of the early 90s. You know, when I worked in the central bank, right, the central bank was the tallest building in the city. And it still has amazing views out over the city. And if you were up on the 5th or 6th floor of the central bank, you could see the city. And what you saw was an urban wasteland, dereliction, vandalism, buildings being almost propped up against each other, right? So that was the early 90s. And then with urban renewal and grants and incentives and subsidies given for building and development, the actual city centre turned around. And the population of the city centre has doubled since then and continues to increase, right? Because lots and lots of flats were built, lots and lots of people came into town, more restaurants, more bars, more clubs. There was a sort of a golden age of Dublin, maybe about 10 years ago or maybe 15 years ago, where it was a really happening city.
And why was that? Like, who sparked that off, or was there something specific that
there was something specific? There was, again, Charlie Haughey, in fairness to him,
right?
Charlie Haughey came and presided over something called Temple Bar Properties. Now, Temple Bar, so the whole area from Parliament Street to Westmoreland Street and down to the Quays and up to Dame Street, that big square area there was owned by CIE, and CIE wanted to knock everything down and create a bus station. Do you know that? A bus station. That was it. And Haughey said, no, we can't be doing this. And we're going to create a company called Temple Bar Properties. And what we're also going to do is we're going to give very significant tax incentives for developers and residents to actually live in the centre of town. So what he did was he said, your mortgages are all tax deductible if you buy in the centre of town. So it changed dramatically. So there was an incentive for developers whose profits were tax deductible if they built in town.
Right.
And for owners whose mortgages had a big tax deductible chunk. It was a really, really brilliant policy, right? And I have no idea why it has been abandoned, because it made a huge difference. So you see a massive increase in building flats and developments in parts of town that people had up till then been fleeing. So when you see all the North Inner City, Mountjoy Square, all those areas, the Quays, all those flats in the Quays, Temple Bar itself was all tax driven. And I've always said economics is about incentives. If you say to somebody, I'm going to give you a tax break to do something, they do it, right? That's very, very clear.
Yeah.
And in fairness to Haughey, he came up with that and said to the CIE guys, no, you're not going to bulldoze the city. You've already bulldozed half the city. You're not going to bulldoze anymore. And Temple Bar became what it is, right? And that was entirely tax driven.
So why don't we do something like that now?
This is exactly where I'm going to get to, right? So this sparked a huge resurgence in inner city living in Dublin. And of course, cities are only as good as the residential population. That's the key. If you look at all great urban theories and great urban theorists and people who think about cities, it's all about residents. It's not about tourists. It's not about visitors. It's not about people just coming in on Saturday night. It has to have living streets. And in the 1990s into the 2000s, what you had was a massive increase in the population between the canals in Dublin. And that transformed the city because with people, you get bars, you get restaurants, you get cultural events, the theatres are full, the cinemas are full, you get gigs, you get all sorts of things. It's like a virtuous urban cycle. More people means more revenue means more taxes means more public spending means better infrastructure. And as house prices begin to rise, more and more developers come in and take a punt. And what you have is a sort of a virtuous circle of commerce, people moving into the city centre. What you pointed out last week, John, is maybe a straw in the wind that is over, that 30-year period. So you have a 30-year period from 1960 to 1990 where the city is strangled and is emptying out. And it's exactly that idea of the donut, right? So people are fleeing to the suburbs and the city then begins to become a wasteland. Then you get a massive injection of government policy, tax breaks, etc., and the city turns around. Now, of course, one of the other factors, of course, was demographics, John. We had a young population, and that young population wanted to live in the city, wanted to take a punt, didn't want to live in the 3-bed semis that their mum and dad had, and actually wanted to go and live in a 1-bedroom, or as you said, a 1.5-bedroom flat like I had in Parliament Street. Now, that period of 30 years may well be over now. And that is the key issue. So, John, let me just, because you were saying to me last weekend, or last week, you were saying, I have this feeling. And the interesting thing is you're not wrong, because the stats substantiate exactly what you're saying. And I'm going to give you them, right? So in the first quarter of this year, 2024, Dublin hospitality sectors saw a 2.5% decline in spending at hotels, bars, restaurants, right? Just the first quarter of this year, the most significant contraction since the tail end of the pandemic. So tourists are still coming, but locals are not. And it's the locals that keep spending up, right? And of course, it's kind of since the riots last November, lots of people are saying, I'm not sure about that. And then if you look at the survey, Amoric Research, which is a very, very interesting consultancy, found that half of Dubliners, people surveyed, are going into town less due to safety concerns. And 40% of people across the country, when asked, are you going to Dublin or do you go to Dublin? 40% have said they've either limited or entirely cut out their visits to Dublin. Right. 82% of those people who are reluctant to visit say they've stopped shopping in the centre, while 60% of people have said they've stopped eating out, exactly to your point, in the centre. And retailers last year saw a 90% drop in Black Friday sales compared to the year before, precisely because of the riots. Now, the Vintners Association, the publicans, said 96% of pub owners are worried about the current level of policing on the streets. It's not just not enough guards, right? And customers are worried about their safety. Half of all Dublin publicans, this is amazing, said that their customers have expressed worry about being on the city streets after the pubs close, right? And a poll carried out last year again says 70% of all Dubs have seen drug dealing on the street, crack dealing on the street, coke dealing on the street, and people have seen antisocial behavior. And so what you're talking is that 90% in a survey of 1,500 people, not significant, but actually representative. And they believe that 90% believe that antisocial behavior in the city has become much, much worse over the last 10 years. So your sense, John, of what's going on is substantiated by actually the data, that everybody is feeling this. The vintners are feeling this. The bar owners, restaurant owners are all feeling that people are now not going to Dublin. They're hanging out in Dunleary or Ranelagh or Clontarf or Howth or wherever, right?
Yeah.
They're just not coming to town.
It's incredibly sad when you put all those stats together. And as I was saying, that the feeling that you get when you go into town now, it's incredibly sad to kind of witness essentially the death of the city. But it has to be said, though, and it's something that you said at the very beginning there, it's not just a Dublin issue. This seems to be happening, you mentioned American cities, but also in European cities.
Absolutely.
And it's as a result of quite a number of things, like the Airbnbization of cities and property in the center of towns, etc. But let's just talk about that after a bit of this.
Fair enough.
Mark, we were talking about Dublin there and the kind of death of Dublin, as it were. But also you take a look around Europe. Like one of my favorite cities in Europe was Barcelona. The Barcelonians, if that's what they're called, have been out in the streets protesting about tourists, which is a really bizarre thing since a huge part of their economy is based on tourism. But it's because of the Airbnbization of the property market. And that's kind of happening all over the world. Barcelona is just the immediate one. Like we mentioned San Francisco before. That's a city in decline as well.
Well, let's focus on San Francisco, because San Francisco, up until recently, was, as you said, the tech center of the world. It was Silicon Valley. It was billionaires, millionaires. Lots and lots of young people flocked to San Francisco to make their fortune, in effect, right?
Yeah.
Today, in downtown San Francisco, occupancy rates for offices is below 50%. Now, what that means is that half of San Francisco's offices are empty. Half.
Wow.
And that happened incredibly quickly. You couldn't get space in San Francisco 10 years ago or 15 years ago. You just couldn't get it for love nor money. Now, half of all offices are empty. So they are having a massive, massive commercial property crash in San Francisco. And of course, what happens is that once commercial property crashes, everything else crashes, right? Why? Because commercial property, offices bring people, people bring trade, trade brings retail, retail brings tax revenues, etc., etc. Once people are not working in the city anymore, it needs to be replaced by residential. But if your residential market, as you said, is being gummed up by the likes of Airbnb and planning legislation and the fact that we can't build enough stuff quickly enough, what you have is you've the total emptying out of the center of the city. And that's exactly what has happened, not just in San Francisco, but lots of other cities. The Barcelona thing is slightly different. They're basically saying, look, tourists do not the city make. You need residential people. Exactly the same thing is happening in Amsterdam. If you talk to Dutch people, they're basically saying Amsterdam is just now a tourist city. They can't afford to live there, the local Dutch people. And of course, then what you're doing is you're hoping to God that tourists keep coming. And the Dutch, of course, at this stage are saying, no, we've too many tourists. We need people. And it's exactly the same thing in Dublin. If you look at commercial property in Dublin, it's obvious that Dublin's commercial property market is in the middle of a massive downturn. Loads of offices lie empty, vacancies on the rise. And of course, what happens in commercial property, John, is that you get this sort of herd effect, that investment surges into commercial property as it did in Dublin in the last 15 years, certainly in the last 5 years, building offices. And of course, there's massive overcapacity. Exactly this happened in San Francisco. Right now, 15% of Dublin offices are vacant. I would say that figure is really massaged by estate agents because they don't want to frighten the horses, right? Yeah, I would say it's much, much higher than that. Really? What happens, of course, is that because of the way in which financial models work for commercial property, loads and loads of commercial landlords will not drop rents even as they face diminished demand. And what tends to happen is they hold out, and then they just think, oh, fuck it, let's just drop the rent. And that's the trigger moment where loads of the investments, which were substantiated by X amount of rent coming in, and the models were based on X amount of rent, those models then are turned on their heads. And that's when you get a commercial flight from the city. And once you get commercial flight in the city, you need something to replace that. And what is that? That's the daytime economy, John. Think about the nighttime economy, right? The nighttime economy in Dublin is frankly awful. I talked to my kids. They said, there's nowhere to go. There's no clubs. There's no venues. I was actually talking to somebody last night about seeing the Clash in the SFX in the early 80s, John, right?
Right.
The Clash was supported by a Belfast skinhead band called the Outcasts. Did you ever remember them?
Right, I do. Yeah.
And of course, I was my little Blackrock College boy in the back.
Yeah.
Thinking, get me out of here. But you could go to see bands in Dublin. Loads of bands. There were small venues, the SFX, the TV Club, all those places.
Yeah.
You talk to the kids now, those venues are gone. You've got the big sort of Taylor Swift, 100,000 people in the Croke Park idea or Aviva, wherever she played, right? But it's the small bands on a Wednesday night and a Thursday night. It's the venues that are a couple of hundred that keeps them going. Those venues are gone. You ask the kids about clubs. There's very few clubs. Lots of clubs have closed down.
Yeah.
You can't survive. A city's nightlife cannot survive on the traditional, we'll offer you a skinful of pints between 8 o'clock and midnight, and then off you go. I mean, there has to be something else on offer. There has to be some.
Do you think that the traditional concept of a city doesn't really exist anymore, or is changing? Cities become almost museum pieces, like Amsterdam, like you were talking about.
Well, exactly. Look, a city has to be alive, and it has to be alive 24/7. So not only is the daytime economy slumping as a result of the commercial property slump, but the nighttime economy isn't replacing that. So, for example, I'll give you another statistic. A country of similar size to us, New Zealand. New Zealand estimates in a recent piece of research, right, that the nighttime economy in New Zealand is worth about 10 billion New Zealand dollars. That's about 5.6 billion euros in activity. It supports 180,000 jobs, the nighttime economy. That's 7% of all employment in New Zealand.
Wow.
By contrast, Irish pubs and nightclub industry, right? So the New Zealanders pull in 5.6 billion euros a year. Irish, same type of population, same size, only makes the Irish clubs and pubs industry pulls in 2.6 billion in revenue per year. So it's less than half the New Zealanders, and only employs 43,000 people as opposed to 180,000. So that gives you a sense. The reason I said New Zealand, it's not that New Zealand is known for its nightlife. People don't say, oh my God, Auckland is brilliant, or Christchurch for nightlife. This is just a similar sized country with a reasonably functioning hospitality sector, far less tourists than us, far less tourists than us.
Yeah.
And its actual nighttime economy is over twice the size.
So how do we fix this?
So the first thing you've got to realize is that we go back to the great American theorist of all things urban. And listeners, if you really want to get a handle on urban economics, read a woman called Jane Jacobs. We've talked about her before, John, in the podcast. Wrote an amazing book called The Life and Death of Great American Cities, written in the 1970s. An extraordinary thinker. But her basic idea is that cities have to be living entities. They have to have living streets, but much more importantly, planning has to be mixed use development, right? So that means residential, commercial, and cultural and retail all have to be in the same area. So you don't zone an area, that's the IFSC for finance, right? Or that's South Inner City Dublin is, for commercial rents or for commercial buildings. Everything has to be mixed development. So you have to have people living, you have to have people working. It's like the ad for Mars bars, John.
Work, rest, and play.
Exactly. Cities have to be places where people work, rest, and play. So she also made a very interesting point about crime. She says that crime happens on empty streets, on streets that are not populated by people. She called this thing eyes on the street. She says if a street is populated by people in a residential area. Those people have a stake in that particular street, and they tend to police themselves. It's a very interesting idea, right? Right. When you have streets that nobody lives on, people surge into town on the weekend just for the crack, drink loads of pints, and go back home. Those streets, she said, are very dangerous because they don't police themselves, because nobody feels any ownership of the area. So her whole idea is that cities will come and go and trends will change, and you need to be adaptable and diverse in a way that the city has to roll with the punches, right? So changing lifestyles, revitalizing the inner city, creating a dynamic, creating it being safe, secure. That urban environment has to be fostered by planning, that somebody has to sit on the top. Remember I talked to you about Charlie High?
Yeah.
He had an idea, which was, if I create a tax break, people will respond. And we did 30 years ago. We now have to have something very, very similar. Someone say, okay, what is the problem? Are there too many Airbnbs? Yes. Okay, well then limit Airbnb. Limit very short-term letting. Leave those houses and apartments, come onto the residential market. So you have long-term tenants in places that are now being used by tourists for Airbnb. Does that affect casual landlords? Yes, it does. But again, the whole idea is, if you want to change the city, you have to do something at the very, very top.
So you're saying use the tax system and regulations, but overseen by like a planning czar, as it were.
Yeah. Somebody who wakes up every morning and when they're brushing their teeth is thinking about Dublin. Because nobody has that job, right? And of course, what you find then, because there's no planning, there's no czar, to use your expression, there's no person with the overall responsibility, what you get is this hodgepodge of, do a little bit of this, do a little bit of that. What we know, and I'll come back to we land here, John, is that Irish people don't like paying tax, right? End of story.
Yeah.
If you create an incentive structure, as Haughey did, to say, you go and live in the centre city, you go and develop in the centre city, people will respond, right? We need to get the ratio of offices to residential. There needs to be a ratio, and that ratio needs to favour residential. So every time there's a planning application, John, to build an office block, somebody has to say, no, actual fact, the ratio has been hit now, and there's too many offices vis-a-vis residential, so you can't get planning. But you can get planning for residential. So it has to be kind of blunt as well. And everybody needs to understand that these are the rules. And again, it sounds very, very mechanistic, but I think we should have a target for population between the canals. Not just Dublin. I'm talking Cork, I'm talking Limerick, I'm talking all Irish cities, right? Have a population target to say, we want X amount of people to live in the centre city. Therefore, we're going to create X amount of development opportunities for residential, for different flats of different sizes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to have an entire plan. And that plan is going to be given financial muscle by tax breaks. And tax breaks work. Ireland's entire economy, think about the multinationals, it's all based on a tax break. We know that these things work. And we know, and this is the fascinating thing about tax breaks, is that you don't lose revenue by creating tax breaks to generate activity, because the activity, which otherwise doesn't go on without the tax breaks, generates the revenue in itself. It's that idea is it's much better to have people living, working, and developing than having a vacant site. Much, much more interesting for the economy. So the tax breaks, by their very incentive structure, create the dynamic to create more revenue, and that more revenue more than pays for the tax break. So it is like a virtuous cycle. But if we don't do this, John, what you felt the other week when you were talking to your mates about not going to town will move very quickly from a feeling to a fact. And what we've seen in cities is that when you go from a feeling to a fact, it is very, very difficult to reverse the decline. And the decline in Dublin from 1960 to 1990, where half the population disappeared, is the warning sign from history. These things happen. It's happening in San Francisco. It's happening in other cities. It's happening all around the world. And if we don't intervene right now, and it's a really urgent issue, if we don't intervene right now, the city will become denuded of population and will lose not just its character, but it will lose its economic potential. And that's a travesty for the capital city of any country.